I'm Lindsay Koshgarian, Program Director of the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Even in normal times, U.S. cities and states are heavily reliant on federal funds. While New York City has typically relied on federal funds for about 9% of its total revenues, it depends on state sources for an additional 17% of its revenues, or roughly a quarter of revenues overall. In 2019, New York State received more than 36% of its revenues from federal sources. The city, state, and federal budgets are inextricably tied. Needless to say, these are not normal times. Nationally, cities and states are expected to lose approximately $189 billion in revenue in fiscal year 2021 due to the COVID crisis. The City of New York has taken steps to increase revenues and cut costs, but if even more severe cuts are to be avoided, federal assistance must be a part of the solution. With much of the aid provided by the CARES Act expended or expired, no new aid package is immediately forthcoming. And yet, there has been far too little debate on the nearly $750 billion that the United States spends each year on the Pentagon. In fiscal year 2021, New York City taxpayers alone will contribute more than $29 billion toward the $740 billion military budget, unless Congress acts to limit this spending. This includes $14 billion for military contractors and an estimated $2.7 billion for forever wars, paid by New York City taxpayers alone. These expenditures do not make the people of New York safer. In addition to the desperate need for relief from the COVID crisis, the United States discretionary budget directly supports many of the programs that support New York residents, including Title I aid to public schools, the Child Care and Development Block Grant, and housing programs like Section 8, public housing, and homeless assistance grants. This summer, the House and Senate voted on a proposal to cut the Pentagon budget by 10%. And redirect the savings to human needs. A 10% cut could return as much as $2.8 billion to the city of New York every year. That would be enough to fund weekly $600 in unemployment checks for 370,000 New Yorkers. In the midst of ongoing shortages of personal protective equipment, a cut of just 1% could return as much as $290 million to New York City, enough to buy 85 million N95 protective masks. That would be enough for medical workers to use the masks as intended, replacing the mask after each use, through 2 additional COVID surges as big or bigger than the first. As the pandemic ends and life returns to normal, a 1% Pentagon cut would be enough to fund 39,000 additional childcare vouchers. A 10% cut to the Pentagon would be enough to fund job placements for 390,000 unemployed workers, more than half of the currently unemployed workforce. We can cut military spending without compromising our security. A Washington Post investigation uncovered a Pentagon report that identified $125 billion in wasteful Pentagon spending over 5 years. The Pentagon buried the report and made no effort to address the wasteful spending. Proposals put forth by security and budget experts have called for a 15% reduction in service contracting. And the United States still spends $70 billion per year on forever wars. Since 2001, New York City taxpayers have contributed more than $206 billion to the cost of wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere. These are not the priorities of most Americans, and yet our political system continues to yield more military spending that does not make us safer. These same investments made in our communities would lead to increased safety, prosperity, and economic security. Thank you.